Welcome everybody, my name is Andrew Wilkins. I'm the publisher of Bookseller and Publisher magazine, which is the magazine of the book industry here in Australia. And I'd like to welcome you tonight to Readings, Books, Music and DVDs, as it's now called, for this event to meet the gentleman to my right, Luke Davies, who is the author of a fabulous new book, God of Speed, which is available in huge piles at the counter over there. Luke, as many of you will know, is the author of the very successful book Candy, a novel which has been turned into a film, and Luke won the AFI Award for Best Adapted Screenplay for that, and has spent the last year in Los Angeles pursuing other screenplay work. Of course, we're not lost to Australian Letters isn't lost to him, or he isn't lost to Australian Letters, hence God of Speed. You may also not know Luke is also a very well-respected poet, and a poet of the very highest order. Age Book of the Year? Yeah. Totem, his most recent volume, won the Age Book of the Year, the overall Age Book of the Year, not just the poetry section, but the overall Age Book of the Year a couple of years ago. And I've had the privilege of editing one of his collections myself, Running with Light, which was also a very successful collection. So, without further ado, please make welcome Luke Davies.
Tell people. If anyone would like to
come down. There's a few seats down here.
Feel free.
Come make yourself comfortable. Oh, don't be shy. Luke, maybe I'll start just by some general scene setting here. You've just done a Frank Morehouse. You've written a book which has no Australian content, therefore disqualifying yourself from the Mars Franklin Award. The book is about Howard Hughes. What on earth possessed you to start writing about a man when there's been so much written about him, including some feature films, some TV movies, all sorts of things? What did you feel that you had to say about Howard Hughes that hadn't been said already, and what was it about him that attracted your attention?
Well, I thought that there was an awful lot that hadn't been said about him or that hadn't been understood correctly. And I wanted to be the one to plunge deep inside his fractured mind and dig around in there a bit and explore and try and get right what I instinctively felt was right about him and what I instinctively felt had been misunderstood about him in the popular way in which he was recognized as a historical figure. It's almost in the cliche land of the obsessive-compulsive billionaire hoarding his own urine in jars and so on. I think that story in particular is an example of an apparently apocryphal one, although his obsessive-compulsive disorder was out of control weird. Beyond that, look, there were two things really. One was at a really large scale, the guy connected to every major kind of theme of the 20th century in some way. I see Howard Hughes always as this kind of Where's Wally figure. You know the Where's Wally children's books? It's like whatever area of the 20th century you want to look at, he's there in some way, touching upon it. The beginnings of electronic media empires, he was there. Speed and power and Hollywood fame. The way in which people started to become famous with the rise of the electronic media empires. In the 1930s, Howard Hughes was really one of the best known people in America in particular, but a great hero to people of the Western world before his great fall. But I believe that Howard Hughes was as well known in a sense as Madonna and Michael Jackson were in recent years. Richest man in the country, most eligible bachelor, and heroic aviator who was seen by the public and the media to be a person who had risen above the obstacles of inherited wealth, which is a really fascinating thing about America, that is seen as an obstacle, inherited wealth, that one is seen to be a fatso resting on one's laurels, and that Howard Hughes' endeavours to break world records and invent certain new kinds of aeroplanes and so on was part of his heroism, which made him much loved.
His extraordinary man, and as you said, he's been involved in lots of things. He was a very creative man as well. Was the man who invented the bra? Who was that?
I can tell it's
He, again, that's one of those semi-apocryphal stories that was a bit of a beat up. He was very much involved with publicity beat-ups himself when he needed the public to pay attention to him. At other times he made himself invisible. He cast Jane Russell in the movie The Outlaw, the last movie that he directed, and she had enormous breasts, and he knew that this would be a selling point for the film, and he deliberately... Two selling points. He deliberately tried to push the boundaries of bad taste and to kind of challenge the censorship or whatever they were called, the motion picture, I don't know. But anyway, he claimed to have designed a bra that had a sort of wire understrap thing or something like that pushed her breasts up even higher, and he claimed that he got the design idea from something he'd done with an airplane that he'd designed. Or I think it was all really just a publicity beat up, but it was a huge story when that was happening, and various decency bodies wanted the big billboards of Jane Russell banned and so on. It was a very controversial story at the time. Storm in a teacup now.
So we won't take that particular metaphor any further. Your book is essentially a monologue. You're talking in Howard Hughes' voice. You're becoming him for the purpose of this novel. And the action of the book, such as it is played out in his mind, isn't it? How on earth do you go about entering not only somebody who is from another culture, but also from another time, someone who, in a way, has maybe no connection with you personally and with your particular heritage? How did you find yourself getting inside his personality? What were the challenges in getting to understand what made him tick as a man?
I call the book a demented interior monologue, actually, to give it its full title. There's a couple of things. I can answer that question, which is also answering the second part of your first question, which I forgot to answer before because I rambled off in a different direction, which was, number one, there was the importance of him in a big public way, and number two, at a very personal level, was that when I discovered that Howard Hughes was a drug addict, a lot of his strange behaviour made more sense to me, and I thought that the way the world viewed him was stripped of its context of him being a drug addict, and that he was seen as a kind of circus freak. And because of my own experiences with addiction, I felt that there was something that I could explore there. There was something that I could leap inside, in effect, with the assistance of my past, you know. So it's like diving into a place with an oxygen tank, which was my past, and being able to explore this realm in a sense with something that I knew about, you know. I was interested in the way both addiction and obsessive and compulsive behaviors are forms of self-medicating one's anxieties and fears in a way, and I was interested in trying to explore how that would have come about and where it might have come from, and what would happen to a person who wanted to have everything and was capable of getting it effectively, you know. It's, in a sense, it's a moral fable about a man who wanted to have everything and who became autistic precisely because he got what he wanted and could have what he wanted. And what would happen to a person who could indulge their most decadent impulses without any obstacles and surrounded by enablers. So at a very personal level, I was trying to look with compassion at a man who never came out the other side of a very crippling situation, and I felt that I had the good fortune to come out the other side of a very crippling situation. So there was a personal connection there. As I naively began the book thinking, this is the book I have to write, and sometimes over the years that followed, because this book was a long time coming to fruition, sometimes I found myself asking the question, what are you doing here? The more I learnt about him, the more I realised what an unbelievably ugly man he was, and that at times was a really uncomfortable place to be. But I tried always to find that thing inside of him that was worth loving. You know, that glorious and beautiful person who was filled with such potential and who, in a sense, achieved it and then lost it. Or looking at it another way, he never achieved it. He drowned in his own limitless possibilities.
He has a lot of fun in the meantime, though, doesn't he? I mean, particularly at the early part of the book when he's recounting his numerous romances with very famous names that all of us will have seen movies of, the Catherine Hepburns of the world, the Susan Haywoods. That would have been an awful lot of fun to write, I imagine. There's a lot of hijinks goes on. There's a particular episode with Catherine Hepburn at about 18,000 feet, which is worth... I don't know whether we can read it out in a family setting, but you must have had a lot of fun writing that, just as much as he had actually, maybe not quite as much fun as he had.
Performing it. There was, the sex scenes were full of energy and I really enjoyed writing them a lot. Perhaps I wrote too many of them. I've cut a lot of, it took years to get this book right, and I wrote way too many sex scenes, and a lot of them are not in the book anymore. But I think the ones that remain are there for important reasons. There's less sex than you think there is in the book. Maybe it's just that the scenes that are there are a little bit full on and they stick in the memory. But a lot of stuff is just touched upon. There are only a few scenes that go into great detail of what's kind of going on. I mean, they were leaps of the imagination, clearly. The book is very much hung on a framework of real events. Like, every single thing that happens in the book, even the weirdest of them all, such as New Year's Eve, 1955, Howard Hughes takes 3 women out to dinner in 3 separate restaurants at the Beverly Hills Hotel, thinking, I don't know what he was thinking. Nobody to this day knows what he was thinking about how that would succeed. And of course it ended disastrously within 45 minutes of him going from table to table, having minders calling him away for important phone calls. And every single event in the book that is happened in one form or another, but of course it's all about interiors, and that's the stuff that I've imagined completely, including what he was doing, having sex with Catherine Hepburn, or having in the middle of a plane crash or whatever. But there's a historical framework there of kind of reality.
One of the things that's very, very noticeable about the book as you start to read it is how episodic it is. It's almost as well like you're choosing little scenes, little vignettes from his life. Sometimes the chapter can be only half a page long in places. How did the structure of that How much of the structure of the book dictated by the subject you're dealing with, and how much of it was actually your determination, I'm going to write a book in this way? Because in many ways, you're a poet, and I felt a lot of these little chapters were almost like mini poems in a way. So can you talk a little bit about how you went about the structure and why you chose that particular structure to write the book?
With pleasure. I knew always that this would be a book about one man's madness, which tended to simulate, portray in some kind of vivid and real way that madness, which meant I always knew that there would be a fairly chaotic narrative, but I think in the middle stretch of writing this book, I was concentrating on the diamond-like nature of the pieces themselves, but I kind of got lost in the chaos of the narrative, and part of the home stretch of getting this book just the way I wanted it to be and really lean was in reordering the chaos so that it's still there and still apparent, but that in fact it's really tightly controlled. In early drafts of this book, I had a kind of floating present. Sometimes he'd be telling something from the point of view of 1973, and sometimes 1968, and sometimes it'd jump back to 1930. And at a certain point, I hit upon this idea that the whole book would take place in one night. The device of the book, in a sense, is that it's June the 9th, 1973. It's the night before Howard Hughes was to fly at the controls of an airplane for the first time in more than 15 years. In that 15 years, he had been living in darkened hotel penthouse suites all around the world, watching movies all day and injecting himself with codeine and other drugs all day long, and trying to control his empire with memos. And finally he's going to fly, and he's invited an old friend, Jack Reel, the guy's name really was Jack Reel, an old Lockheed executive from the 50s who used to share this obsession with aviation. Jack Reel has flown over from Los Angeles to help organize the flight, and he's downstairs, one floor below, sleeping off the jet lag, and Howard Hughes is anxiously and neurotically going through his head of what he wants to say to Jack Reel when Jack wakes in the morning before their flight, because he's spoken to no one for 15 years other than the Mormon assistants who look after him, with whom he has no kind of personal relationship. And I just thought, imagine that, imagine 15 years without ever having a conversation that mattered with someone, without ever talking about something that you care about deeply, something that you love. Imagine that, and being completely drug-addled and out of touch with reality, and having all that anxiety coursing through you. You know, that's like the vehicle of his voice, is this all-night monologue, where it's kind of like, I got to remember to say that to Jack, and I'll say that, and I'll tell him about that. And a lot of it's a justification for his life. In a sense, what the book is a moral reckoning with what he did and how he treated people so carelessly, with his kind of with the void that was at his center. And when I struck upon that device, the book started to flow and tighten up and kind of bounce. And and some of the chapters are really small. Partly that's because a lot of the time there's a kind of ecstatic kind of register going on, and it's hard to sustain that for too long. And little epiphanies, and I needed to bounce around between different levels of reality. The other thing that happened was I found, I came across all of his memos, thousands of memos. The memos in this book are real Howard Hughes memos. This was like a gift from the gods. These memos are so completely insane in terms of his obsessive-compulsive disorder being out of control. And for me, they were just a gift, because I was able to put a handful of these memos throughout the book, and they act as a kind of counterpoint to the inner narrative that's going on. You see these actual documents that Howard Hughes wrote. If you weren't at this talk tonight, you wouldn't necessarily know that until you get to the end of the book and read the acknowledgements page, so it's meant to come as more of a shock, but unbelievably weird memos, and they more than anything tell something of the real madness of this guy.
One of the things I noted when I was reading the book, and I guess the sex, lest we dwell on it too much, is one example of that, is the sensual nature of the writing. That maybe one of the ways in which you get inside this man's skin is the way you're describing how he's experiencing the world in a sensual way. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that's very, very powerful. There's a particular session when he's going through a dive where he almost crash lands, where you really feel that you're sensing the experience of being a man in a cockpit, hurtling down to the ground to your death. Can you talk a little bit more about getting inside his skin in that kind of way?
Of being a man in a cockpit hurtling down towards the ground, masturbating. That was the first piece of writing I ever wrote for the book. That passage that you just mentioned was the original chapter that I wrote when I had the idea for the book. Well, I enjoyed writing the fine line of the paradox between the fact that he strove for complete sensory overload, spiritual ecstasy, union and communion with the divine, with the women through sex, and that at one and the same time he was a completely crippled man, denuded of all compassion, sociopathically cold in many ways, who experienced his world almost completely abstractly, and yet who kept in his later years of drug addiction striving to recreate some kind of Garden of Eden type, original state that he could never regain. That's the basic nature of addiction too, I guess. But yeah, because it's a first-person monologue, I got to explore those realms of sensuality, and his great obsession, perhaps his two great obsessions, were women and sex and flying. I got to have a lot of fun with doing stuff about flight. He was a remarkably lucky man. He had 5 plane crashes, of which 3 are in my book. 2 of them are not particularly important, they were minor. One of them was moderately bad, and 2 of them were horrendous, and he somehow survived those, and I got to describe what those crashes were like. But yeah, his final 20 years, he was not living in a sensuous world. He was living in a world of absolute remove from everything, even remotely sensual. And it was really nice to chart the tragic journey of the fall from great height to great depth.
To you, Luke, is there a trigger, is there a moment in his life where you see the descent start? Or do you think that it's a trajectory that was inevitable from the beginning?
There's different ways of there's a difference between what I think was there a moment in his life and is there a moment in the book that tries to portray that. It's definitely a continuum and a trajectory, a downward spiral. You could go right back to his incredibly stifling mother, who had her own germ phobias, who inspected his testicles for lumps every night after the bath until he was 8 years old, who slept in the same bed with him instead of his father, until he was 8 or 9 years old, and who instilled in him a great fear of germs and so on. I mean, there's that whole issue. I chose not to go into that too deeply. The way he sort of catapulted away from this life that he had between a stifling mother and a kind of absent father, and maybe spent the rest of his life seeking to flee from his mother, and yet at the same time rest his head between her breasts, so to speak, metaphorically speaking, with other women. But no, in actual fact, in the 30s he was beginning to show odd behaviour, but in the 40s it really went very bad very quickly. In the book there's a chapter where he had a nervous breakdown. Doctor said to him, if you don't have a rest, your body's going to do it for you. And he flew off with one of his pilots, and they've landed in Louisiana, and then he took a Greyhound bus to Florida with a suitcase full of money, and he disappeared for 3 months, didn't care about his empire. And I've imagined what that 3 months was like, and I see it as a kind of really lovely nervous breakdown that he kind of had at that point. Shook himself out of that and came back to the real world, and then really began to go downhill from there. So that's a kind of significant chapter, but it really is a continuum of decay, mental decay, yeah.
I've just got one more question. Maybe we might open it up to the audience, and then if you're willing, maybe get you to read a section of the book. There's a phrase that Howard Hughes uses about himself in your book, your character Howard Hughes, where he talks about himself living at the end of history in 1973. You used that phrase. What did you mean by that? Was it his phrase he used himself at some stage in his memos, or was it, in what sense was it the end of history in 1973?
No, that's not a phrase that he ever used. That's just whatever. I made it up. What I meant by that, it was an attempt to portray the completeness of the self-obsession of the addict. That the addict lives fully in the present moment in the worst way possible. That thing that we all supposedly strive for, to experience the present and so on. He was the center of the universe, narcissistic, solipsistic, and that it was the end of history because there was nothing beyond him. That was the way he viewed things. All that existed was himself and his needs and his syringe and so on. And so that he was at he was always at the end of history, is the way he would have viewed himself, because he was always at the cutting edge of the present. That's all I really meant by that. Thanks for coming, and I'll just read basically a sort of 3-minute chapter early in the book, not particularly controversial, safe for all ages, and it sets the scene in some ways. Perhaps I'll read like a 1-minute memo as well, just to give you an idea of the memos, and then I'll come back to this. We'll start with something insane, and then we'll move back to something more pleasant. Just let me flick to the memo page. This is a fairly mild and mundane and average Howard Hughes memo. They get more insane as the book progresses. Memo 1951, Coats. I didn't write this, Howard Hughes wrote this, so it's a bit of a cheat. I want all coats that need to be cleaned and hung together someplace. I want the same thing done with the trousers and hung together away from the coats at least 5 feet. This may be in the same closet, but only if large enough to accommodate the insulation provided by the indicated space. I want all shirts and everything else laundered and put in a container of some kind. A white cardboard box is preferable to wood. It is not good to leave these in the laundry boxes, however, because there are other items in there too. All pockets should be emptied. This means pockets in shirts, coats, and overcoats. You may consider that all coats and trousers which are hanging in the closet are empty, but any coat or trousers that you pick up from a chair or anywhere else should be searched. Whatever you take out of the pockets should be placed in the proper category. I want you to think like me and be on your guard about contamination. I want to thank you for thinking ahead about this. So, there's a circular recurring motif that runs through the book, which is the round the world record that Howard Hughes broke in 1938. In a sense, he didn't really break that record, he created it. And so this is the beginning of the book after the prologue. I was no Fred Astaire, but on July 9, 1938, the night before I took off to fly all the way around the globe, I danced with Katharine Hepburn at the starlight roof of the Waldorf Astoria. So there's 7 or 8 minutes of my life accounted for already. No Fred Astaire and she no Ginger Rogers, but I loved nothing more than the feeling of my hand placed flat on the smooth skin between her shoulder blades as we ebbed and flowed among the other dancers. The utter simplicity of it, the peace I felt. I had the sense that my hand itself, rather than my mind, was soaking up a memory and storing it away for future use. That turns out in a way to be the case, for it is the coolness of her skin that I am remembering now. I have, of course, other memories of more intimate parts of her than that smooth cleft of back between 2 shoulder straps. But just at that moment, on that glamorous and distant night, the delicate pressure of my fingertips on her skin was what it meant to be a couple. It seemed that my future was contained there in my present. Now, 35 years later, and on the night before another significant flight, God bless us both, Jack, my mind goes back to that time when my limbs were more supple. It would do us not one whit of good to be able to predict the future, for nothing turned out the way I expected, and yet here I am, my bruises and scars intact. Kate would be an old woman now. I was never one for old women, so I don't imagine we would have gotten this far together, not with all the will in the world. That is irrelevant to the specifics of 1938, when it was entirely sufficient to believe in the eternal. Her perfume was like a promise of the oasis that lay ahead of us that night. We were out and about in the admiring crowd. The next day I'd be flying off to glory. Tomorrow, a more private kind of glory. No one here with whom to share it, no one but the unperfumed Mormons, or Jack Reel, for whom I have much affection, but whose bare back I would not wish to touch. But I am dealing with my circumstances, and trying at last to move beyond them. We spoke of so much in bed the next morning, July 10, 1938, the sky so blue through the hotel window. How extraordinarily beautiful was Kate, even stripped of all makeup, even emerging bleary-eyed from her Howard-entangled sleep. I have never seen a greenness so transparent. It is as if the light reflecting off her irises illuminated the faint freckles on her nose. I thought she was in love with me. The very idea seems preposterous now. I'll miss you, Kate, I said. She smiled and kissed me on the forehead. You be safe up there. I want you to be safe and warm. Yes, yes, I laughed. I've packed your scarf. And I want you to contact me any which way. Telephone from Timbuktu, cablegram from Cairo. I'll find a way, I said. And do come back in one piece, because I don't want to be picking up the pieces. What it meant to be a couple, it was like being breathed upon. It meant that later in the day, among the thousands of well-wishers seeing me off from Floyd Bennett Field, it was Kate, at home in Connecticut by then, who was more present to me than anyone else. It meant that she was with me as I flew, because I knew that all was right with us, and that I would be flying in a vast circle to see her again. I stood proudly by my plane, the so eloquently named New York World's Fair 1939. The press asked me many questions. It is nonsense, the idea of news, Jack. But oh, to be a hero. Thanks very much for coming.